She actually saw a light, a white light, enter her body.
And from the middle of the light came the words, "You are healed."
A force just took hold of me and lifted me up off my feet.
And as I was looking at her, I mean, she just radiated light.
And there seemed to be a personal force standing in the doorway to prevent me from entering.
It was just a wonderful miracle.
What comes to mind when you hear the word miracle? Incredible coincidence? The power of mind over matter? Biblical stories like those of the burning bush or the parting of the Red Sea? What do we mean by a miracle anyway? A miracle is something that appears to be unexplainable by the laws of nature, and so is thought to be supernatural in origin or an act of God. Webster said that. Unexplainable by the laws of nature.
Just like hundreds of years ago, like no one would imagine a man walking on the moon. If they saw it, they would call it a miracle. Maybe in 500 years, the miracles that we see every single day that we can't explain will be explainable.
So when we hear contemporary stories that seem to be unexplainable by the laws of nature, we have to ask, are these miracles? To shed some light on these mysterious happenings and how they affect lives, we'll look into some contemporary accounts from people who believe that miracles do happen. We'll hear in their own words their personal stories of miracles. Joan Webster-Anderson, a magazine journalist and author, says she experienced a miracle firsthand and went on to investigate other stories that were then published in her book, Where Miracles Happen.
I had this image of miracles as happening in huge shrines or to very special people, or perhaps things that happened years and years and years ago, but certainly not today to ordinary people. But one day I was out raking our leaves in the backyard, stuffing bags full of them, when all of a sudden I looked down and realized in horror that my wedding and engagement rings were not on my finger. When I looked at the backyard, I realized they had to be out here somewhere, but there was absolutely no way that I was ever going to find them. And just then, a friend of mine stepped through the hedge which divided our two properties. Now, I didn't know her real well at that time, and she trudged across the leaves and said, "What's wrong?" She could tell, and I held up my hand and said, "I've lost my rings out here." And she said, "Well, let's pray about it." She grabbed my hand and pushed me down in the leaves to a kneeling position. I'm thinking, what if someone's looking out the window and sees us doing this? But at the same time, it seemed so nice. And she began to talk to God about it. She just said, "God, we need a miracle. We have to find the rings. They're out here. You know where they are." And then she kind of stopped. And I thought, well, now that was really nice of her. But not for a minute did I think anything was going to happen. She got up. She started walking across the lawn, and she went around a huge pile and then stopped, as if she was listening almost. And then she took a couple more steps, stopped in front of another pile, reached down and pulled out both my rings. Now, they were not connected. So the very fact that they were both there, and she pulled them both up and said, "Here they are," just as if she wasn't even surprised.
"How did you do that?"
And she said, "Well, I didn't do it. God did it. He told me where to look." And from that time on, I began to change my perspective of what a miracle was. When you put them in a framework that people can identify with, then you find that a lot of people say, "Oh, well, I've had a miracle."
I was in the shower, kind of listening to the pager, and my tones went off. It came across as a car fire.
I felt such an urgency like I've never experienced before. I felt like I had hands on my back just pushing me, and I needed to get out. I needed to hurry up and get to the scene.
Mary Mueller, a firefighter, was the first emergency worker to arrive at the scene of a tragic automobile accident. What happened next is described by Joan Webster-Anderson, who included Mary's story in her book.
Now, the ironic part here was that there was no fire, ultimately, but the first call that came in summoned firefighters because it was an incorrect call.
I got within a couple 100 feet of the scene itself, and I couldn't imagine what had happened here. It seemed like a car bomb had gone off. There was just complete devastation. There was tires all over from one side of the road to the other, out in the field. There was the top of the vehicle had been peeled open like a can opener. At this point, I looked down into the ditch area and I saw a body down there.
She slid down the snow on her knees to this woman and discovered that she was bleeding to death from a massive wound. Mary had nothing to stem the blood except her firefighter's gloves, but they were covered with soot, and she felt, I can't put that on this young woman's head because I'll introduce so much infection.
And I knew that I needed something really quick, and there was no medical help around, and I had nothing. And in a split second that I looked over to my left at the car, and I looked over to the right at the bystanders who were a good distance away from me, I just reached way down in my heart and I said, God, I really need some help here. I'm gonna lose this girl. I can't do this by myself. And in that split second, a reddish color medical bag showed up approximately 12 inches off of my left knee.
There were no footprints around it in the snow. There was no way that it could have appeared, but there it was. And she said, I didn't even have time to wonder at it. I clicked it open. It had everything I needed, all the white gauze pads, everything sterile. And she began to take these out and just use them one after another.
When the EMS personnel did get there, the ambulance crew, paramedics, they came down, and at this point, I was out of bandages in the bag itself. They were all gone, and it was perfect timing. They got there, they did their assessment after I told them what I had had, just to verify things, and the paramedic kind of pulled my hand up just a little bit to take a peek at the injury, and he put my hand right back down, and he kind of whispered into my ear, so not to upset the victim, he says, Mary, you're holding this girl's life in your hands. Don't let go. And I'm like, oh boy, this is a heavy job. So I kept the pressure on the best I could, and because of the severity, they taped my hands to her head to keep the pressure on, and then they taped both of us to the backboard.
Took them to the hospital, and the girl recovered eventually. About an hour or two later, Mary left the hospital and went back to the scene to recover that mysterious medical bag.
Mary found no evidence of the mysterious bag, no discarded bandages, no sterile wrappers. The bag had vanished.
The bag was gone. And I said, well, who cleaned this up? And they said, nobody cleaned it up. We thought, you took it with you. I said, I couldn't. My hands were taped to this girl's head. And made many inquiries, had many questions, and they all just came back to nobody knows where it came from, and we haven't seen it since. After that scene, it's gone.
Paul Robert Walker, author of Every Day's a Miracle, also began his research as a result of a personal story.
I was eager to do the book, but I wasn't quite sure how to get into it, how to approach it. I wanted to tell the stories with an authenticity and an honesty and a humanity. And I was thinking about it, I realized that I had been living with my own miracle story for as long as I could remember. And it was really very much a part of my life. My story it really began with my mother. It's my mother's story. My mother and father had been married for about 10 years in 1952, and in that time, they had never been able to have children. And they felt that they better take the steps for adoption because they really wanted a family. my mother prayed, asking that she be granted a child of her own, and saying too that if that was not in God's will, she would gladly adopt a child and do everything she could to be a good mother to the adopted child. Well, after she said the prayer, my mother felt as if a real weight had been lifted from her, that she had placed her problem in the hands of God. Well, 9 months to the date from that prayer, I was born. Now, I don't remember exactly when my mother told me this story, but I was quite young, and it has imbued my life with sort of a sweet sense of mysticism, a sense that there really is power out there, that there really is a spiritual world, and that in fact my very life is a product of that power.
There are times when miracle stories seem to carry their own badge of proof, when circumstantial evidence shows that something incredible happened. But other times, they don't. Authors like Joan Webster-Anderson and Paul Robert Walker hear many reports of miracles. How do they know these stories aren't just fabrications or fantasies?
I look for the authenticity of the person. What has this person's life been like since this happened? Have they changed? Have the people around them changed as a result of what they're doing?
Does this person have anything to gain by fabricating a story? You know, it's kind of like, what would be the point of making up this story? But then, when we get into the process and I start looking at corrections, I'm always looking to see, are the suggestions they're making, do they seem to be looking to correct the story for accuracy or to make it a better story? Now, again and again, I found that the people with whom I was working were making corrections that, in my mind, sometimes made it somewhat less good of a story if I were just making up the story.
And then I go forward and try to find corroborating testimony for it. I don't usually do that until after I've gone through this process of discernment about the person. From that point on, the story becomes the property of the reader. And the reader can decide whether he or she wants to believe the story or not. I think it's very important to chronicle what is going on today. And it isn't necessary to say, that was a miracle, this was just a nice coincidence, this was important, this isn't.
Stories of miracles sometimes appear to defy the laws of nature. But one man, Rodney Kephart, found himself in a strange no-man's land of invisible forces 50 years ago, caught between two great powers, pitted in a historic drama that would soon unfold for him in a most unexpected way.
I arrived at Wake Island in May of '41 as a carpenter working construction, building an air base. As you know, in 1941, on December the 7th, the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor. First warning we had was the airport exploded, and then I rushed out onto the back of the platform where I was working at the carpenter shop, and I looked up into the eyes of the Japanese that were strafing us with .50 caliber machine guns.
Immediately following the attack, Rodney rushed to the hospital to volunteer his help.
That night, we run 21 patients through surgery between 9 and 1 in the morning, everything from amputations to shrapnel removal. And the next morning, when I was relieved, I began to look for a place to take some rest, and there was a room at the end of the corridor that had 2 empty beds in it. And at that point, I approached the room, and it seemed to be extremely light in the room. And as I approached the door, I just seemed to lose my momentum as to go forward, and there seemed to be a personal force standing in the doorway to prevent me from entering, because I had tried 3 times to enter, and the same thing, I couldn't proceed. So I just felt I better go on down to my barracks, even though it was a half-a-mile walk. And try to get some rest down there.
Exhausted and confused, Rodney walked back to his own barracks, giving no further thought to the bizarre incident, until he put it together with what he saw the next morning.
The Japanese just raided us again, and they dropped an incendiary bomb in the hospital that dropped in the room where I had chosen to go to sleep, and that burned the hospital.
Rodney feels that his life was saved by the unexplainable force which had prevented him from stepping into that ill-fated room.
So that looks like one of the reasons that I'm here today, to be able to talk to you, because my life was spared by that miracle.
Scholars discuss miracles in the light of contemporary scientific reasoning.
From about the 15th or 16th century on, there began to be a split between how scientists looked at the world as this complicated machine, and how religious and moral philosophers were looking for meaning and values that transcended the purely physical. And I think that split is now slowly beginning to heal. Scientists are much more aware of how many presuppositions they do have, how much they don't understand. They've learned a certain amount of humility. And religious thinkers, on the other hand, are trying to understand what they're feeling and trying to say in terms of what we know about the universe and what really is out there that scientists can tell us makes up reality.
You know, my journey has taken me from what you might call the more mechanistic approach that we're taught in medical school, you know, how to treat a disease, and that it's been very much of a spiritual journey in the sense of realizing people want help living. It isn't just getting over their disease. And as I do this, I keep questioning myself. And part of it is when somebody has a disease disappear, and you say it's a miracle, and why I even played with that word in my first book, Love, Medicine, and Miracles, to make people think about what is a miracle. If someone comes to me with extensive cancer, and we have the path report, and I've operated on him, and I know he isn't cured, and it's 12 years later, he's never had treatment for cancer, there's no sign of it in his body. You see, is that a miracle, or is it something explainable? Well, I'd say even if we can explain it, it doesn't take it away from the miraculous.
So in that regard, there's always room for miracles. There's always going to be things happening that we don't understand and that we can't explain. And it doesn't mean that the people who experience those things are crazy or that they're religious fanatics, but there are things going to happen that we don't understand. And if they strike you as a miracle, then we need to take that seriously.
One of Jeannie Hunter's facial nerves was cut during surgery for a tumor in her ear. As a result, she lost her sensation of taste and the hearing in one ear. Worse yet, Jeannie lost her sense of equilibrium and was unable to walk or maintain her balance for the better part of each day.
And I significantly changed my lifestyle to be just on a couch or in bed for most of the day and most of the evening. That was not a very acceptable lifestyle, so I consulted a second physician who offered me no more hope.
After 4 years of suffering, losing her career and marriage as a result of her inability to function normally, Jeannie attended a healing service.
As I was driving to the church, I heard very clearly the words, "This can be the last time that you drive to the church sick." And I was getting kind of excited because I knew that was not my thought. And then when I got to the church and began to open the door, I heard the words again, "This can be the last time you walk through this door sick." Now I sat and listened to her service, and she talked about the Holy Spirit. I did not know the power of God for healing. And I sat an hour and a half watching her pray with other people. The girls that I had friendships with said, "We'll ask her to pray with you." So she laid hands on me, and then the girls who were there to pray with me prayed, and at the same time my prayer was this: Father, I ask you to either heal me right now or let me die, because I have no life. And then suddenly, everything became enveloped in a white cloud, just like a fog rolling in. And I thought they were in this fog with me.
Jeannie underwent what she describes as an out-of-body experience in which she encountered a warm and healing light.
They had laid me down on the floor of the church. I saw my legs that looked like fluorescent light tubes. Now I know at this point that that was the Holy Spirit moving in and removing the illness from me. But at that time, my thoughts were, if I am on the floor, what do I look like? Because I had all the thought processes that I have right now. And I was bending over to see what exactly did I look like. Suddenly from the right came a pink white light that spilled out in two triangles. And from the middle of the light came the words, "You are healed." And I read the words, and for some few minutes there, then the Lord sent them to me and they touched me here. And I heard him say, "You are healed." And then when I awakened, on the floor, everyone was around me that had started praying with me. My hearing aid had come out of my ear. It was lying on top of my skirt. And I was trembling with just a tremendous amount of surging that continued because the illness had gone and all of the things that had been wrong were restored. I received my balance back, my hearing was restored, and the taste grew back. So I picked up my daughter, who was 13, and I told her that the taste had grown back and we went out to eat. So while she had ordered a French vanilla ice cream, banana, pineapple drink, I'll never forget it, because the minute that I took a little sip of this, it was like putting 15 Starbursts in your mouth and they just explode. And I was going, "Bananas, look, bananas are back." And I'm going up, I just get up out of the table and run up and down the side of this restaurant where no one understands that I'm just now tasting for the first time in 4 years. And I'm trying to get them to drink from my cup. They weren't real interested in doing that. So I just recommended that they go ahead, order this drink. You will not be sorry. And we came back to start living and learning how to live well and having a new hope for being able to share this, that others would know this is for you today. The most important part of the whole healing was knowing that we have a God who loves us. He's tremendous.
In Monterrey, Mexico, a young woman had a tumor that she described as being about this big in a lower abdomen, and we prayed with her. And she had an experience where she actually saw a light, a white light, enter her body as we were praying. And that white light went to the tumor and began to treat the tumor, to enfold it, and she said she could literally see the tumor disappearing until it was gone.
When people discuss coming into this light, I think they are, again, coming back into this energy. That light is energy. And so they are becoming a part of it again. And it is loving. I mean, I say that, I remember talking to a doctor over dinner once saying that my definition of God was intelligent, loving energy. And he said, "Well, how do you know it's loving?" He'll give it intelligence and he'll give it energy to create, but how do you know it's loving? I said, because if I incise somebody with a knife, they heal. And if God didn't love me or my patient, they would bleed to death and die of an infection. So we have this built-in ability to heal.
At the time of the Protestant Reformation, many of those leaders felt that miracles were over. the age of miracles had happened already, and that there was no reason for them to continue, and that they were not continuing. Many of them eventually changed their minds, or their successors did. But there are churches today who still believe that there are no such things as miracles.
We'd been studying the Bible where Jesus said, when you give a lunch or dinner, don't invite your rich friends, your neighbors, or your relatives. Invite those people that can never invite you back, the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame, and your Father in heaven will reward you. So I said, well, I've never done that strictly and literally. We fed a lot of people for a long time, but we've never done it just that way, so let's do it on Christmas. And so I said, I'm going to do it on Christmas. If anybody wants to come on.
Ladies made burritos, tamales, sack bags of Christmas candy, cookies and oranges and stuff. Christmas Day, we meet in front of Our Lady of the Youth Center, all of these trucks and cars and people, and they bring all of his food. Some ladies brought some cake, and they had made cakes. And I brought 25 bologna sandwiches. That's 2 loaves of bread. That makes exactly 25 sandwiches. A lady had brought a ham, a big ham. We load all our vans up, our trucks and everything, and then we cross the border.
To my surprise, they were all working in the garbage, and they had no idea it was Christmas. To them, every day was the same. They didn't know there was no Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, or holidays. Every day was the same, Christmas included, and they try to eke out a living grubbing through the garbage.
I've been in war. I was in the Korean War, and I've seen things, you know, but this shocked me. This was really shocking.
The condition of the people was terrible. We found out later that every single man, woman, and child on the dump had tuberculosis.
Father Thomas was accustomed to estimating the amount of food needed to feed a large crowd. But the turnout that day was more than 3 times what he had expected.
I had thought there'd be 120 there. There were a lot more. We said we don't have enough food, but we'll share what we got.
They'd broken out this big ham, and they'd put it on the tailgate of my truck. And this lady starts to cut the ham. She's cutting and cutting and cutting ham, giving out pieces. And I see everybody walking around with a burrito, a tamale, a sandwich, or a piece of ham in their hand, having a good time, just having a wonderful time.
After a while, this young man came to me with a big slice of ham in his hand, and he said, have some ham. And I said, no, there's not enough. He said, yeah, there is. And so I said, there can't be. He said, well, look, this. And I looked around, there was people who had a big slice of ham in their hands about as big as a, half-inch of ham. Well, that didn't register.
And I'm looking around, seeing all of these wonderful things happening. At the side of my pickup on the ground, this lady was giving out these little Christmas bags of candy to the kids. They'd get a bag and they'd run out and they'd put it in a box or in a paper sack, and then they'd get back in line. Well, I figured for sure we're going to run out of candy, and I hollered down to Jean. I said, Jean, we're going to run out of candy. Look what they're doing. Well, she couldn't control it. She just shrugged her shoulders.
I was taking pictures of children, boys, with sacks of food, and they would come and fill their sacks up, take them home, empty the sacks, and come back for another sack of food. Well, it took several hours for all this to penetrate my minds, and as everybody began to share.
Father Thomas stopped keeping count when the crowd surpassed 400 people who came for the Christmas meal, originally planned to feed 120.
It didn't occur to us until after we had come back, of the miracle that had happened, because we knew what we had taken across, and we knew what we had given. We saw with our own eyes all the people that were there, and we saw what was left over after everybody had gone home, where you even had enough to go take down to the orphanage. That was truly a wonderful, wonderful thing.
We stopped on the way back to El Paso at an orphanage in Juarez and left the food there. I found out a long time later that a person from Juarez had food left over, and they had stopped at another orphanage to leave the food that was left over. And this really got our attention, and we said, well, if God multiplied that food, that's a sign that we have to go back and help those people. And so that was the beginning of a ministry at the garbage dump that's gone on even to this day.
Yeah, over there, that's a cutaway of what they're all living on top of. That's what the garbage, the old garbage, it's been there for years, and they just built on top of the garbage. They haven't got any running water, but they have barrels here. But you can see all of these homes right here, and off in the distance, way in the distance, you see the United States of America. 30 minutes from right here to the wealthiest nation in the world, and you have all of this.
Frank Alarcon was so touched by what he saw happen that day, he took it as a sign that he should stay in Juarez and help the poor people in that town.
That evening when I went home, that I went in my room and I closed the door, and on my knees I begged God for a job with tears in my eyes. I was so in love that evening. I was so in love.
He left behind a comfortable retirement in the U.S. and organized a daycare, a doctor's and dentist office, and other services.
And that's the pharmacy room. We charge 10 pesos a visit, and we give them the medicines if we have them. If we don't, then the doctor will make out a prescription for them to buy. If they have the money, fine. If they don't, then we'll buy it for them. And the same way with the dentist. If they have the money, if they don't, they still get treated. A little white building, all the cars on top. I have a little room in back of there.
He now lives in a one-room dwelling with a single light bulb and a mattress on a dirt floor.
Super room. This is where we celebrated Christmas 1972, right here. And it was just a beautiful, wonderful day. I thank God for that Christmas. It changed my life. I can't take any credit for anything. I dare not take credit for anything because I'm not capable of those things. These are just wonders that God has done.
When our film crew went out to investigate these stories at the Lord's Ranch, they were greeted by something quite unexpected.
We just arrived here, and I told our cameraman that we needed to shoot a dark sky because when we get home, I'm planning to superimpose a rainbow for an effect. And not 30 seconds later, we turned and saw this most beautiful double rainbow I've ever seen in my life.
This is a sign that the Lord has given you to show you what He does here. That He performs miracles here. And this is His sign for you, that rainbow. Made to order.
Richard Musilek's son, Paul, was caught in a mugging situation, and he was beaten very badly. Richard got the call that night that Paul was in the hospital with terrible damage to his head and face.
I could not believe what I saw. His eyes were bleeding. They were so swollen shut and so swollen out of proportion that he looked like some strange creature, literally out to here. And blood all over his face. He just looked like a piece of raw meat that had just been slaughtered. He was still conscious. Of course, they couldn't give him anything for the pain because it was trauma to the head. And I almost immediately became extremely angry. Who would do this to my son? And he related the story then as to what happened. He said, Dad, he says, I simply got out of the car and I turned around and wham, someone hit me, and apparently hit me more than a couple of times.
Richard was filled with a white-hot anger to get these guys, and he went looking for them all day Saturday and couldn't find them. Talked to people on the street, offered a reward, anything. He said, I was going to break their kneecaps first before I gave them to the police. I think that would be a natural reaction for anyone. But the following day, he went to church with the baseball bat in his car.
Wouldn't you know, the homily that day was on forgiveness. And I still get a little choked up about it, but in my pew, I made a conscious decision to forgive those people, whoever they were, and not to pursue the vindictive type behavior that I was. And while I was sitting there, I recalled that I had to forgive those people too, because I couldn't pray for my son's healing if I held something against someone else. So I forgave, and I prayed for my son's healing, and I asked the Lord to take it from my memory. I mean, you know, the bad feelings. And He did. Anyway, I went to the hospital that morning, and upon exiting the elevator, one of the nurses spotted me and said, "Mr. Vuslak, it's your son."
We can't explain it. We don't know how it happened.
And I didn't remember exactly how I took that, but I kind of trotted the rest of the way to the room. There I saw Paul. The swelling had gone down, and he had opened his eyes. By this time, of course, a lot of the blood was already cleaned up off of his face and such, but I mean, in and of itself, it was like a miracle that he was actually able to open his eyes and the swelling had gone down. So then on Monday, we went back to the hospital to take Paul home. And we're amazed, really, in seeing Paul with only bloodshot eyes. Not a contusion, not any evidence of any scratch or harm or beating at all. I mean, the swelling was completely gone down. He was in fine spirits. Later I found the report, the doctor's report about the exit x-ray of Paul, and wherein on Saturday there was a fractured skull, evidence of a fractured skull by x-ray. On Monday there was no evidence of any fracture at all.
Most people focus on Paul and the marvelous restoration of Paul's face, which of course is a miracle. But I would have a tendency to think that the other miracle was the healing of Richard's heart. On faith, he finally was able to just throw away his baseball bat and his plans for revenge. And after that, his miracle happened.
A miracle is something that appears to be unexplainable by the laws of nature, and so is thought to be supernatural in origin or an act of God. The stories we just heard speak of profound and life-changing events and phenomenal experiences that appear to be unexplainable by the laws of nature. For the people who live them, they are quite simply their own personal stories of miracles.
The thing that we have to understand is that most of us have been brought up to think in terms of reason, rationality, to look at things philosophically rather than theologically. And while both philosophy and theology will deal with some of the same questions and same issues, their starting point is entirely different. Philosophy begins with reason. Theology begins with faith. Faith doesn't require proof, or it wouldn't be faith.
So often in miracles, we see that sometimes the power of prayer, it's brought on by someone else. And I think we forget that the power of prayer is beautiful in that a lot of us can get together and pray for one person.
For those who can live their life putting out unconditional love to all those around them, that kind of agape love, and certainly living a life of, loving God. I think those people probably experience miracles, little amazing coincidences all the time. And I think the closer we get to that ideal, the more likely we are to experience miracles.
People are looking for answers. I think in the last couple of decades, we thought science really was going to be able to provide us with answers, that we were going to find cures for all of these diseases, that we were really going to understand how the physical world operates. And now we're not so sure if science can provide those answers. So we're looking for other places of how we might try better to understand what the world is like and how cures can be affected. And religion is providing a certain amount of answers, and people are finding miracles or things that strike them as miracles as something that's very interesting that might indicate that there is more to reality out there than scientists can tell us.
Miracles happen every day, and it doesn't have to be at a terrific accident site. It could be something as small as giving somebody a smile. You don't know if that person is going to be down or not, and that smile could be what changes that person's course in life, that, yeah, somebody does care for me. And that's how these miracles happen, is by caring for each other, and that's why we're here.
The miracle doesn't end there. What happened to the scar tissue? That's the miracle.
There were too many individual circumstances involved for it to be just a happenstance.
Some people might say, no, it's not a miracle, it's just a coincidence. But I am convinced that it is an answer to prayer.
And I'm thinking, how can this be? This is a joke. This does not happen.
Regardless of our personal beliefs about religion or the supernatural, we all recognize when certain things happen that break the rules of everyday life. When something out of the ordinary happens, whether you call it a miracle or a coincidence, it can stop you in your tracks and make you take notice. The year was 1950. Herb Kiff and 13 other singers in the West Side Baptist Church Choir usually arrived a little early every Wednesday evening for their 7:30 practice. But on one memorable night, Herb was running late.
I was at home at that time writing a letter to our denominational headquarters in Chicago. And I wanted to get that letter off and drop it in on the way to choir practice. But I was running out of time. Finally, I got it done. So we hurried over as rapidly as we could and got there, and the west side was dark, completely dark, no lights anyplace, and wondered what had happened. I had to park about a block away from the building and realized that when I got there, the steeple was lying about where my car usually was parked. 3 minutes before the time for the choir to begin to practice, suddenly there was a terrific explosion that simply blew apart the entire church. A gas leak explosion. The sidewalls were blown out, the roof and the floor system wound up in the basement. And surely nobody could live through something like that.
The fire chief immediately enlisted Herb's help to provide a head count of any survivors so they could determine who had been trapped in the rubble.
I rounded them up, and nobody was missing. Everybody was there that we were looking for. Each one of those people was detained just enough to miss that explosion. 2 little girls, senior high kids, usually were very prompt. But this particular night, one of the girls said she wanted to wait until the program was over. She wanted to see the finale of the program that she was interested in. And before the finale came, the explosion went up. Another one was my cousin, Harvey. His wife was out of town that evening. She'd taken a little girl along, but he had 2 boys, and the neighbors had invited them over for dinner. And as they sat around, the conversation was good, the meal was good, and they talked too long. So they were late. There were others who had a story very similar. Well, we held hands in a circle. We formed a circle and gave thanks for the deliverance that we had had because we realized that a miracle had taken place. The time was set so accurately because the steeple, when it fell, also cut the power lines exactly 3 minutes before the beginning of the choir practice. We know that because the clock stopped at the radio station exactly at 27 minutes after 7 o'clock. And there's some people who scoff at miracles because they don't believe it. It can't be. It just happened. But there were too many individual circumstances involved in that church explosion for it to be just a happenstance.
Coincidences usually happen unexpectedly, but some people attribute them to their own conscious desire or prayer. In the following story, a mother traces back an amazing coincidence to a special request she had made.
My daughter and her husband, who have 2 little boys, had told me that they were vaguely thinking of moving because their house was a little too crowded if ever they would have a 3rd child. So I had just remembered that, and I thought, oh, well, why don't I go and have a look in the neighborhood?
She had driven around her neighborhood for about an hour when a white house with black shutters caught her eye. She remembered seeing it several years earlier when it had been up for sale and knew that it would be perfect for her daughter.
So I parked in front of it and I prayed to the Lord, and I thought, Lord, I know that what I'm asking is a little silly because this house is not for sale. Obviously, people are very happy in that house. But do you think that perhaps you could put it on the market? 2 days later, my daughter called me and she said to me, Mom, we have made an offer on a house. And I said, yes, already? Did you find something really good? And she said, yes, I think we did. And it's not very far from you. So I said to her, it's not far from me, where is it? She said, well, it's on a cul-de-sac. And I said, on a cul-de-sac? You mean, could it be a white house with black shutters? And she said, yes. So I thought, that must be the house. It was the house. And I said, but Christine, it's not for sale. And she said, it's going to be for sale in 2 days. My college roommate lives a few doors from it. And she told me that the neighbor told her it was going to be for sale in 2 days. So my children were able to buy the house. And now I love to sit on that lawn in front of the house and look at my grandchildren play with their new friends on that cul-de-sac.
People say that love seems to be a motivating factor behind the miracle stories they tell us about. Love from a friend, love from a parent to a child, or compassion for a stranger.
Some people might say, no, it's not a miracle, it's just a coincidence. But I am convinced that it is an answer to prayer. I was not in a terrible need when I prayed. I wasn't just begging God to meet a need of my children. It's a prayer that came spontaneously to me when I was in front of that house. And that makes me think of the letter of Paul to the Corinthians when he says that we don't know always how to pray and that the Holy Spirit prays for us. I think the Holy Spirit put that prayer in my mouth.
I remember a story of a woman who was very nervous about walking down a bad street, and she saw a loiterer up ahead, and she thought, this guy is bad news. So she'd been reading a book about angels, and she said, "Oh, angels be with me now," which is a very nice way to ask, all that's really necessary. And she went on past this guy, and he looked her up and down. She could feel him sizing her up, but he didn't do anything to her. And she got to the corner and then broke into a run and got to her home safely. But the next day, she heard there had been a mugging on that corner about 10 minutes after she passed, and it was another young woman. So she put on her red coat, which she always wore in the wintertime, and she went off to the police station and told the police officer what had happened. And he said, "We have that man in custody. It is the same man." She looked at him in a lineup, and it was him. And she told the officer that she was curious as to why he let her pass. And the officer said he was too, and he would ask the criminal. And the criminal said, "Oh yeah, I remember her, the one in the red coat." But he said, "I wouldn't have bothered her because she had those two big guys with her, one on either side." So when you hear this story, you gasp and you think, "Oh, what a wonderful story." But I thought right away, what happened to the mugging victim? Where were her angels? Now, I firmly believe they were right with her. If I have an angel, then you have an angel. One of us is not singled out for attention at the expense of the other. The question always is, why did the angel stop to help the woman in the red coat, but didn't keep the victim from being mugged? It's the age-old question. We really don't know.
Why do some people get healed and not others? Why do some prayers get answered and it seems others don't? And I don't have a quick answer except to say that God is not fundamentally in the miracle business. I will learn to receive what God has to offer and not try and put God under my control.
Sometimes it may be that God allows difficult things in our lives in order to bring good out of them later.
We are not alone in the world, and I think we are part of a huge tapestry of interrelations. And what to us has been a terrible hurt might be working for somebody else for the best.
Why does a miracle only have to be a correction, say, of what we don't like? Nerve grows back, scars disappear, fractured skull is no longer there. Why does that have to be a miracle? Whereas if another child still has his fractured skull, how do you know that isn't, going to lead to a miracle, you see? Because when you stop judging, you understand what one child said. He said, if God took my little friend, age 6, of cancer, why did God make her in the first place? But then he went on to say, but maybe her brother will become a doctor, see? And maybe that's the miracle. What if her brother discovers the cure because of his sister?
I have to learn not to say, God, heal my broken arm, and get all disappointed or my nose out of joint if my arm doesn't get healed. But when I do see God heal someone, to get very excited and rejoice for them and with them.
In Joan Webster-Anderson's book, Where Miracles Happen, we hear the story of a man whose traveling music ministry brought him 1,000 miles from home. He was at a crossroads in his life, not knowing if he was really helping anyone, and was looking for a sign.
We were traveling as a musical family, going through Ohio with 2 big motor coaches, with our family and some others and a music group, going to churches and conventions and so on. And I was going through a real trying time in my life because I was thinking, where am I in my life? What's going on in my own life? I'm telling other people they can have answers. Do I really have the answers myself? Has God really called me? Or should I maybe quit and get a job?
Even a person as spiritually well-developed as Ken Gobb still reached a point in his life where he said, God, I don't know if what I'm doing is the right thing to do. Is this pleasing to you? I need to know, and I need to know soon. I'm burning out. Give me a sign.
These thoughts were going over and over in my mind. So when everybody went to eat, I stayed in the coach, and Sat there a while and I got thirsty, so I walked down the street to get a Pepsi. And I walked back just slowly, casually, and I heard a phone ringing. And I listened, and what is that? And there was a phone booth near a gas station. And I remember it just rang and rang and rang and rang. And I thought, that's odd. Wonder why it's ringing like that. Maybe it's an emergency or something for somebody close by. So I went up and just went in the phone booth and picked up the phone and said, hello. Operator said, person-to-person call for Ken Gobb. I laughed right out loud. I said, you're crazy. It's impossible. And then I thought, I know what it is. It's candid camera or a setup of some kind. So I'm looking around and checking my hair and everything. And I heard somebody saying, I believe that's him. I believe that's him. And the operator said, well, is Ken Gobb there? I said, yes, I'm Ken Gobb. She said, are you sure? I said, as far as I know, I'm Ken Gobb. And then the moment I'm talking to this lady who in a desperate time in her life had written a suicide note.
A woman many, many miles away who had once seen him on a TV show, remembered how wonderful his ministry was and how he had said just the right things for her that day. She was suicidal and thought, if I could just talk to that wonderful man one more time, but how would I ever find him? And she was given numbers. She just saw a little collection of numbers in her mind. She called and gave those numbers to the long-distance operator who placed the call to the phone booth.
And I'm thinking, how can this be? What are the odds that somebody called somebody from another state and it'd be the right phone number and the right guy walking by? I don't know if the odds are 1 in a billion or what, but what are the odds of this? And I talked with her and was telling her that suicide's not the answer.
Okay, bye-bye.
Ken stayed in contact with the woman for several months, counseling her regularly until he knew that her suicidal thoughts were behind her.
And that story kind of took a turn from me helping this lady to actually God helping me.
Hey, Barbara, God knows where we are.
Deborah Deckelman was a woman facing her own emotional darkness when she was visited by a mysterious stranger.
My experience happened around 11 years ago, and I was going through a series of tragedies in my life to where I had 2 close friends who were killed in a car accident. I had a miscarriage. I lost my grandmother, and I was dealing with some joint custody problems. I was contemplating suicide, and it got to the point where I decided that the fastest way to do it would be to take the gun and shoot myself. But I called my husband. He came home, and we went into a hospital, and I was admitted there. It was a depression clinic. And as I was laying on the bed sobbing and crying my hands over my eyes, I heard this beautiful voice say, Deborah. And she said, can I come around and talk with you? And I took my hands down and I looked up at her and I said yes, and I was still crying. And she came around, she was a grandmotherly type woman. And she says, I know what you're thinking and you're feeling right now. She says, you're feeling like you're in this pit of darkness and there's no hope for you. And that's what I was thinking. She knew me inside and out. And she says, but I'm here to tell you this is what God wants you to do. He wants you to take just one day at a time and scratch away at that darkness just a little bit. Just scratch away just a little bit and you'll see this crack. And in the crack, every day you do this, you'll see it open and a little bit more light will come through. And every day, more and more light will come through for you. And she says, do you know what that is? She said, that is God's love and promise for you that you must go on. She put one hand on my forehead and one on my heart. And as we prayed, it was like someone brought the sun from the sky and into that pit of darkness I had. And it was all over me and all through me. And I was being embraced by God. I was being comforted and loved in such a way I had never felt before. And I looked up and it was just pure light. My mind and my heart were healed. The depression was gone, totally lifted. She went out the door, passed directly next to the nurse who was coming in at the time. And I asked the nurse who this wonderful, radiant person was that just made me feel so loved. And the nurse said, who was who?
No one but Deborah had seen the woman, and according to the hospital, she was neither an employee nor a volunteer.
I got up the next morning, and I got out of bed, and I went over to the window, and I opened the blinds, and right there, in front of me at the window was this big, beautiful rainbow, and the colors were so brilliant and beautiful. It was my confirmation that God was telling me again, see, my promises are good. My experience led to having forums, and it also brought to me many special people.
Deborah felt compelled to share her story with a small group. So many people responded with their own remarkable stories that Deborah organized a forum.
On the town square in Hanover, Pennsylvania, in a converted storeroom above a gift shop called the Rose Trellis, there's a special meeting going on. Welcome to the second meeting of the...
Nearly 500 people gathered from hundreds of miles around to share their own stories and to hear the experiences of others. One of the persons to attend Deborah's forum was a gentleman named Albert Gorsuch. He was a self-professed workaholic with a responsible job and a family that depended on him. And then he began drinking.
I couldn't wait in the morning to start drinking. And then I got into gambling and so on. So then this went on for several years. With my wife, is the next morning, she could be out in the kitchen getting my breakfast, and she would be out there singing and going on, and I'd say, God, how can she do these things? How can it be that she can do these things, when she knows what I've been doing? Or I would try to hide part of it from her, especially the gambling part. And one day, my boss came up, and he said, Albert, I had been breaking a man in 2 years for me on my job. And he said, Albert, I can't pay two of you for this job. And I would like you to retire. You're old enough to retire. Well, that's the day that the earth crashed around me.
The only solution Albert could see to his dismal future was to remove himself from the picture.
I went out and got in my car, and I started down the road. And I was crying, and I didn't want to commit suicide, but God hadn't answered my prayers. He hadn't helped me any. And I was crying. I prayed all the way down the road. I said, God, is there no help for me? But I never got an answer. And so when I stopped on the bridge and got out of my car, and as I started over to the railing, there's something, a force just took hold of me and lifted me up off my feet and took me back to my car. And I said, oh God, is this an angel? I don't know how we got over on Ivy Mill Road, which is about a mile away, but it was off the road. And whatever it was had me in its arms. And it was like a cloak, and I was like a little baby in its arms.
To Albert, time stood still. When he finally calmed down, Albert claims that the comforting voice would not leave him until it received assurance that he would be all right.
When it finally was over with, the voice said to me, God isn't done with you yet, son. God isn't done with you yet.
Albert turned his life around completely, and today tells his story whenever possible of how his life was saved by an unexplainable presence. A few minutes on the internet can turn up chat lines and bulletin boards in which people openly share their miraculous experiences. Paul Robert Walker used this technology to help him locate stories for his book, Every Day's a Miracle.
Sometimes, though, just by reading through the postings, I would come across an amazing story, like right here. He writes, "I've also had an experience with an angel, and I believe firmly that it is the only explanation to this story of mine. One night I was coming home from work on the interstate. It was July 4th and approximately 11:45 p.m. I was getting ready to get on the exit ramp when my steering wheel sharply turned to the left, putting me in the fast lane of the interstate. Seconds later, a car came speeding the wrong way down the exit ramp I was about to enter. If I had exited on that ramp, my passenger and I would surely have been killed in a head-on accident. There was no sign of that car when I was about to exit, but surely my angel must have seen what was about to happen. This occurred in 1981, and I still remember to thank my angel for saving my life." It's an amazing story, I think, and it's right there online.
Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, in a speech about religion in the age of scientific skepticism, concluded with an ardent defense for the existence of miracles. A 1996 poll taken for Time magazine and CNN discovered that 82% of Americans believe in the healing power of personal prayer. 64% believe that doctors should join their patients in prayer if the patients request it. Clearly, there are a lot of people out there who do believe in miracles. The public seems hungry for these stories, and readers can hardly get enough of them. Are people more interested now than they were at other times in history with the issue of spirituality?
There's clearly renewed interest today in the spiritual world, angels and miracles and the afterlife. And I think, to a great extent, it's simply a reaction to the material explosion of the 20th century, and that we've come to the realization that we can have all the material things that we could imagine, but there's still a deeper kind of happiness that lies in a spiritual understanding.
Among the growing collection of miracle researchers is Jody Berndt. Her book, Celebration of Miracles, written for Thomas Nelson Bible Publishers, was inspired by a personal experience.
I became interested in the subject of miracles several years ago when my sister, who was in high school at the time, was diagnosed with colon cancer, which was a real rare form of cancer for someone as young as she was, and which we later learned was at a real low cure rate. They had done some studies that had shown that no one as a teenager or child who had come down with colon cancer survived. So we knew that this was a serious thing, and Jennifer, I think, fully believed that God would heal her. That's what she wanted to believe, and she prayed. And as it turned out, she did have a tumor. It was the size of a grapefruit, and when the doctors went in to remove it, they were amazed because, as one of the surgeons put it, the nature of cancer is to grow, and yet it had contained itself. They'd never heard of a cancer doing that. And so once they removed the tumor, they had envisioned that she would need radiation, chemotherapy. They told her not to plan to go to college because she'd be having these treatments. And they sent her off to a specialist at Georgetown University Medical Center who ran additional tests on her and found that she was completely clean. And the doctors have called it a miracle. And I just got more and more interested. And as I did so, I began to meet other people and talk to other people who'd seen God work in their lives. I love how one of the fellows I talked to in preparation for my book responded to this. There was a pastor, his name was Dwayne Miller, and really his story was one of the most remarkable that I heard. And I say heard because I really did get to hear it. He sent me an audio tape, and he was a pastor in Texas who, after a bout with the flu, lost the use of his voice.
I was left with a pressure in my throat. And pressure is the only way I know to describe the feeling. And it was as if someone had my windpipe between their thumb and forefinger and was squeezing it. I sounded like this, and it felt like that. And it felt that way for the next 3 years of my life. I went through a myriad of tests with doctors. They did everything they could trying to determine what was wrong, ultimately referred me to doctors around the country. I've seen doctors from Europe, I've seen doctors from Japan, I've seen doctors from Los Angeles, Philadelphia, New York, Houston. I've seen doctors from most everywhere. And they all arrived ultimately at the conclusion that when I had that flu virus, it got into the nerves of my vocal cords. It was able to penetrate the myelin sheath, which is like an insulation around the nerves. And it ultimately destroyed the nerves in my throat, in my vocal box, vocal cords, so that they did not function. They just hung limply. They gave me a prognosis ultimately that said I would not recover. And the speech that I was able to generate, I was generating with some fatty tissue that are called false cords that are in your throat, but they're not designed to sustain speech. And they told me that ultimately I would wear away the false cords, surfaces, to the point that they could no longer get together and I would be totally mute. They predicted that that should all occur by late '94 or early '95. I should be totally mute. That was their word. All of that is observable on videotape that doctors ran like time-lapse photography. Every time I would go see them, they would put the scope down my throat and record all of that. And so you can watch scar tissue actually form in my throat. My wife became the breadwinner in our family because we had to resign the pastorate where we were. I could no longer preach. I couldn't sustain that. I couldn't go to a sales job because I couldn't make cold calls because I sounded like an obscene phone caller and people would hang up on me. You know, you laugh about that now and it's amusing, but at the time it's extremely frustrating. Emotionally, I was destroyed. Career-wise, I was set aside. In many of the things that I thought were important in my life, I found myself at loose ends. And like other people, I asked God, why? Why?
He was not expecting for God to heal him at any given moment. And one day he was teaching a Sunday school class, filling in for someone, using a special microphone so that his listeners could catch his words, and he's rasping into the microphone. And as he's teaching about God, out of Psalm 103, how God forgives our sins and heals our diseases and redeems our life from the pit, something broke.
In a church of 24,000 members, that's the only class that taped Sunday school lessons. So it was caught on tape.
On the other hand, to say that, since we don't have anything after the book of Acts, that miracles ended at the book of Acts and they never happen again, is equally as wrong. Because you have put God in a box both ways, and he doesn't want to be in the box. So, the psalmist says, I'm excited, bless the Lord, O my soul. One of his benefits is he heals all of my diseases. And then in verse 4 he says, and he redeems my life from the pit. Now I like that verse just a whole lot. I have had, and you have had in times past, pit experiences. We've all had times when our life seemed to be in a pit, in a grave. And we didn't have an answer for the pit we find ourselves in. And I don't understand this right now. I'm a bit overwhelmed at the moment. I'm not quite sure what to say or do. Sounds funny to say, at a loss for words.
And I have to tell you, I still am at a loss for words.
The people in that Sunday school class began to weep and clap, and some were silent, some were laughing. You know, there was just an explosion of joy.
That moment was wonderful, and I thank God for what occurred. But the miracle doesn't end there. You see, I've been back to the doctors, and when I went back and they showed me the last piece of videotape that they shot of my throat, it shows that the scar tissue that had formed there is gone. And it's as slick smooth in the bottom of my throat as the day it all began. Scar tissue doesn't disappear. So even if you could coincidentally explain how I'm able to speak, what happened to the scar tissue? That's the miracle.
These stories have provoked questions in the minds of those who have experienced them. Were these miracles? And if so, what do they say about life and the existence of a creator? These questions stare back at them across the canyon which divides faith from rational explanation, and they have been left trying to find a bridge.
I do know that our life moves in the direction of our most dominant thoughts. I think miracles. I think and believe for answers. And there have been times in my own life when I've been basically bankrupt, didn't know which way to go. And miracles happen, just right out of the blue. And so I get excited about that because I know that God cares for us.
Love is where God is. And if God is right here, then love should be right here too. And it's all connected in a way. I think he shows us that as he performs these marvelous miracles, these little signs and wonders for us. The whole point of it is, I'm here and I love you.
Faith, hope, and love, wonderful chemistry. Hope is an attitude, you see. Fear is an attitude. So the people who have no hope, lots of fear, no faith, and no love, what are they foreseeing? They live out what they foresee, which is death and suffering. And that's why there are physicians who can enhance death. You see, if every time you come to an office, your hope is taken away, love is poo-pooed, and there's nothing to have faith in except the doctor, you go home and die right on schedule, and the doctor says, see, I told you. What are you talking about, miracles? Then you walk into another office, and the doctor says, I love you. What would you like to do? Let me tell you what other people have done who have exceeded our expectations.
I feel sometimes that all that is between our wishes and God to accomplish what he wants for us, what he has planned for us, is our prayer. That's all what is missing, and he wants us to pray.
It's a free thing that God gives us. Free blessings every day, free miracles. You don't have to earn this. There's nothing you can do to earn his love.
We know that he loves us and that he does want the very best for us.
The public way in which this occurred in my life was for the purpose of saying to all of those around me, I care about you as much as I care about Dwayne. I'm as concerned about your prayers. They mean something. So I tell folks today, when you're praying for somebody, don't stop praying, because you don't know when that moment might be that the change will occur. Don't give up. Don't quit. It's not over.